Well, good morning. Cryptozoology has been an interest of mine since I've been about 9-10 years old. I wasn't aware of the term back then, but definitely that was a clear interest. I think most people, as I've entitled this talk about more than just Harry and the Hendersons, I think most people are familiar with Harry and the Hendersons. I don't think I've ever seen it all the way through. I think even probably when the adverts come out, I thought, that's not going to be for me, it's too schmaltzy, you know. There's one bit I quite like at the end of it, where they take Harry back to the woods and you see them all sort of like, as he goes into the woods, you see some other ones running around. That's the only thing I've ever watched it for. But yeah, so Unexpected Awakening. So I was born in 1968, so most of my childhood was spent in the 70s and 80s in southeast London. I always like the fact that Richard always mentions something to do with the London borough of Lewisham, because I'm a Lewisham borough Aboriginal. So born there, 3-4 generations in, very working class, and again, really looking forward to the talk later about the haunted generation. For me, I think it was one of the best series of articles I've ever read in the Fortean Times, and brilliant in terms of so much of that informed where I went with my interest in cryptozoology and other Fortean stuff. So yeah, going into it, so where did some of the first things I get to be interested in? This particular clip I remembered from one of the early Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan films, where they're on safari, either they're just about to be attacked by the Gaboni tribe, or they've just been attacked by the Gaboni tribe, who were terrifying bunch of people, as I remember as a kid watching that. But then there's this funny, presumably bird-like character that just appeared, and there was two of them with a large egg on a nest. And again, it was sort of like, you know, I wasn't thinking cryptozoology at the time, but it was something that interested me in terms of an unknown species. So again, other things that people might think about, yeah, you don't really get your first taste of cryptozoology, but next one I'm sure you will all remember Odd from Carry On Screaming. I know at least one person in this room is very familiar with Fenella Fielding from that film. But again, these things like, you know, as in terms of a Neanderthal brought back to life, Odd with, again, of course, Baby Bod or Junior Bod or Bod Junior, whatever they called him, and other great characters, Dan the Sanitary Man. I just think who's the other one. Anyway, whoever they all are, put different characters in there. Oh, Rubber TT, of course. So again, for me, very sort of like, you know, these fascinated me. I can remember watching it the first time, sometime in the mid-1970s, and my sister, who's a year and a half younger than me, spent the rest of the week sharing my mum and dad's bed. She was so terrified by Oddbod. And then again, another Carry On film, Carry On Up the Jungle, the Oozler bird. Again, a great thing of them when there's, again, one of the expeditions going in, and Frankie Howard is searching for the Oozler bird. And again, that whole thing triggered my interest as a very, very young kid. It was an aspect of it I like, along with all like the humour in there. So, I don't think a reference to this subject is doable without the reference to the baddest daddy of them all. So, for me, it was classic. I'd heard all about this as a kid from my parents. It's a great film. And when, you know, pre even video, sort of thing, you had to wait for something to appear on TV. So when it came in, it's like, you know, great, mysterious island, somewhere in the world, completely uninhabited, supposedly. But not supposedly, not actually uninhabited. They're occupied by a mysterious, unknown civilization, which again probably triggered one of my interests in terms of always been fascinated by uncontacted tribal peoples around the world. And that was really one of the great aspects of that for me. Then they get out, they go into the islands, all sorts of monsters appear, Stegosaurus, Tyrannosaurus makes an appearance, and then of course the baddest daddy of them all, King Kong, who meets his ultimate demise, as we all know, on the top of the Empire State Building. For me, it's just it really is a classic cryptozoology film. I mean, it's not necessarily seen as classic cryptozoology, but for me it is. You've got giant apes, surviving dinosaurs, all come within the realm of what would actually be seen as cryptozoology. Can't avoid this without making a mention to the film The Legend of Boggy Creek. I suspect a lot of you, if not all of you, have actually seen this at one point or other. I think I probably saw this around the late 1970s. Essentially, it's a docudrama. Essentially, it's a half documentary, half drama in terms of a series of events that happened in this small town on the Texas-Arkansas border. From I think around about the 1960s, but actually the stories went beyond that and previous to that as well. Seen as a classic in cryptozoology. Great film, very, very atmospheric, and it's as much a bit of a tribute to wildlife documentary making as well. And again, because some of the other things that I really loved as a kid was watching wildlife documentaries. Probably like some of you, my early television experiences were a black and white TV that my mum and dad had to put money in the back of to keep it going. And again, further evidence why my generation was quite haunted. But again, it's one of those things, one of the things I can clearly remember is watching Jacques Cousteau documentaries and absolutely loved them. And even though we had a black and white TV, it was no problem for me to conjure up all of the colour within that. Other things at that time as well that I remember is very, very clear about the early Japanese Godzilla films as well. Really stuck in my mind as early triggers of my interest in cryptozoology. I wanted to mention here as well, so I wasn't just a TV film kid. In fact, probably quite the opposite. I was very, very, very bookish. I just put some of the books here that I wanted to put up that, really want to thank my school libraries, my early public library experiences, because I wouldn't have got these. And again, we had a tradition in my family, my mum and dad we would have to go to the library at least once a week or once a fortnight. We would have to, the rule was we have to take out a couple of books and I was always in amongst others, the wildlife sections. And these are three of the ones that came up. The Usborne Book of Monsters, I remember that from my school library really, really clearly. The Fantastic Alien Animals by Janet and Colin Board. And again, equally, it gets a bit of not being outdated now, and it is, but I still think it's a fantastic book. Cat Country by Guy Francis. So, some of the stuff I won't be talking about is some of the stuff, because I think there's just, not that they're not good, but there's just so many of them. So things about, things to do with lost worlds. So you've got, good old Doug McClure there in terms of The Land That Time Forgot, The Valley of Guanji, sort of like a modern day Western stroke dinosaur film set in Mexico. And on the top right-hand corner, Albert Finney in the film Wolfen. Again, all very, very interesting films in their own right, but something I'm not going to be, looking at here. So, late 70s mischief, low budget, but decidedly not disco. So some of the things, again, I suppose I was beginning to take more of an interest. By this time, I'm about sort of like 10, 11, sort of like pre-pubescent, but some of the films that came out in that era that I might have seen a year or two later. So, in my normal day job, I go around talking sexual health to sixth formers, and I always like to pick on them, so I'm going to pick on you. If that quote, "Here's to swimming with bow-legged women," means anything to you, you've heard it before, please put your arms up. Yeah, a good half of you. So of course, and it comes from the very, again, classic cryptozoology in my head, and I'll explain why. Jaws, okay? The first Jaws film. Now why is it cryptozoology? So one branch of cryptozoology is looking at outsized animals. The typically accepted maximum size for a great white. I think the largest officially accepted recorded one was about 23.5 foot. The one in the film is 25 foot, therefore to me it trips the thing of being a cryptozoology film. Obviously it's more than that. Particularly in the 70s, but also into the 80s, we'll find that a lot of the films obviously used a lot of the stuff in Jaws as a reference, as a really, really good formula, as something that works in terms of films. So, the other thing around that time, TV, $6 Million Man, and again, one of the things that kept me awake for a long time was the Bigfoot episode. I mean, really, really hilarious to look at it now, and I did manage to get hold of a copy a few years ago. But you know, watching it as a 7, 8, 9-year-old child, it really was quite terrifying. And again, also like I mentioned, one of my favourite Godzilla film monsters, Mothra. How could a giant moth be particularly terrifying? But Mothra was. But I actually like the storyline behind it. So all of these sort of things about what forming my interest in the 1970s. Now we get to grizzly. Now I never saw this until probably around about late 70s, perhaps early 1980s. So it's essentially what it is not. It's not the life and times of Grizzly Adams. I think Grizzly Adams had his own cryptozoological horror in terms of his hair on top of his head at that particular time. Certainly something sort of like unknown to living as a mountain man at that time. He obviously had a good salon somewhere up in the mountains that he went to. But again, so definitely not Grizzly Adams. Now, Grizzly itself is lots and lots of somebody with a hand, with a paw on it, going like that. But the premise is, again, what I say, it follows on from that sort of like Jaws format. So there's 3 main characters. There's the head ranger of the national park. There's his mate Scotty, who's a naturalist, and a guy called Don, who drives the helicopter for various reasons. And it's very much set in terms of it's a big public holiday, the national park is full of people, and it starts off quite closely with, quite at the beginning, with 2 young women campers, and they're attacked. And it's very, very quite slasher movie-ish. It's like there's arms falling off, there's like big scars down faces and things like that. And it's very sort of like that. And it very much goes on like, and it's triggered by, they don't report, obviously, that they've left the park, and so it ensues a search with people going in, looking after them, and they find their bodies. And that says, like, this is a bear attack, Turns out that the bear is not a grizzly, but apparently is an 18-foot short-faced bear. Given no explanation as to how this short-faced bear might have survived, and this is one of the beauty about the films from this era. There's no need for explanations. It's just like, we're going to put in a short-faced bear there, we're going to put in a short-faced bear. Short-faced bears meant to have died out, several tens of thousands of years ago. But that's the story as it goes on. There's more deaths. It's pretty. It's not a great film. It's entertaining for an hour and a half, but that's about it. And it culminates predictably, very, very Jaws-like, with the park ranger, Scotty the naturalist, and Dom the helicopter pilot, having a final showdown with the bear out in the wilderness. Just in case you are terribly excited to find out what happens, I will not give you any spoilers, but you can probably guess anyway. One of the other things about why this is very, very similar to the whole Jaws thing is that they're up against corporate interests. So there's people around who want to keep the park open, even though they know there's a killer bear that lives. So again, it's very, very, very Jaws inspired. Now, my all-time personal favourite, Snow Beast from 1997. Sorry, 1977. Don't ask me what snow beast is. The only thing they're clear about in the film, it is not a Bigfoot because it doesn't act like a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. I can't make out whether it's meant to be some mutant Bigfoot, some type of dog-faced creature, or whatever. Personally, I like to think of it as the unholy love child of Roy Wood from Wizard. I think the hair, once again, is very, very similar. Again, great film. I did manage to get this. It was on TV. I saw it as a kid, and then it was on when I was probably in my sort of early 20s. Had a video recorder by that time, recorded it onto video, and it became one of those favourites when me and my mates used to get in from the pub. Let's put on Snow Beast, and then we just laughed all the way through it at that point. But again, it's not a bad film. So, Crowning Queen Betty, this was one about the jokes that we laughed about it. So again, it starts off quite predictably, as usual, with a young woman. She goes skiing, and she's attacked and killed by the creature. Again, she's reported missing. They find her remains. So again, very much like Jaws, very, very much like Grizzly. There's, again, a not very, very convincing false claw with very, very rubbery fingers. And you don't really get to see much of Snow Beast. It's all very, very done on atmospherics and insinuation. So people go hunting for Snow Beast to see, to try and track it down. Again, it's all this whole thing, so it's set in this sort of like ski resort. And one of the big things they have, this annual ski resort, is it's something like a prom queen or a ski queen or a snow queen or something like that. So it's this big hall, like 4 or 5 times the size of this. It's full of people who've come to celebrate this, and that's Queen Betty. So, it's the whole thing of like crowning Queen Betty, so she's going to be made the snow or the winter queen, whatever it actually is. And Snow Beast ruins the day. Snow Beast decides to attack this big centre during the day. Queen Betty is one of the first persons who sees it. Queen Betty's mum is killed by Snow Beast in the attack. I think her mum's the only victim. But essentially that's it. That's what happens, and then that triggers the more intensive search for the creature. And again, it ends with the police chief, the guy whose family owned the resort, and a couple of other, and his best mate, who's also a former skier, going searching for the beast. And again, I won't do any spoilers, but let's just say Roy Wood's love child meets an unfortunate demise at the hands, or should I say the hands, of a ski pole. But again, not a great film. In terms of being one of the early Bigfoot-esque films, I think it stands up there as one of them, because it certainly triggered lots more stuff to come. Again, I keep saying this, another one of my favourites, the White Buffalo. Now, I love this. Again, you might be thinking, how is this cryptozoology? So, the white buffaloes are very, very rare. So they're a genetic, they're not a normal creature. In terms of their spiritual significance to many Native American peoples, so for instance, the Lakota people, they're essentially the mixture of their god Christ and Mary is White Buffalo Woman. So she is their sort of like, essentially not exactly God, but sort of like folk hero, the originator of their people. So the White Buffalo plays a huge significance in most Native American cultures. The film itself, I've put down there bad sets. Some of the sets are absolutely terrible. A lot of it was filmed inside. One of my favourite sets is with the charging bull, and you can see it on sort of like tracks in snow, and you can see it, and you can see the tracks going through. The acting is questionable, some of it. Good old Charles Bronson is in it, and in some ways it's quite a sad film in many respects. So he's haunted by dreams of this white buffalo. And it's very allegorical because it also symbolises all the people he shot over time as well. So it's tied in with his guilt of murder, and this whole thing, this creature's like an avenging spirit about to kill him, and he realises that the only way he can actually get rid of it is to actually track down the bull and kill it. It's all set along context of about various other people in it as well. So he's got a friend, an old mountain man, and they go looking for it. They go looking for the bull together. Along the route, they also meet the Lakota chief Crazy Horse, who is also looking for the bull because the bull killed his daughter in an attack on the village. And what I'll put down there, I think it's actually a really, really good story premise, because actually the bull can actually be seen as something as avenging. The film is set in the context of where, buffaloes or bison were being killed by the tens of millions every year, okay? And it's very much, the bull is angry. It's symbolising all of that anger about the other animals. And the other thing is, again, why is it cryptozoology? The bull is experiencing very, very unusual behaviour, behaviour that's atypical from a bison. So bisons do not go out of their way to attack people. They don't do things like that. It also finds safety in the mountains. Buffaloes, bison do not live in the mountains and things. Again, slightly follows the Jaws format, culminates in a big showdown somewhere, and the inevitable happens. But it's actually I think it's quite a poignant film. Sets are bad, but again, one of the things I do really love is the music in it. It really gives this sense of this quite twisted, deranged creature. And that comes across really very much in that whole thing. It really gives you a sense of like this very, very sort of like angry, twisted, thwarted animal that's actually about to do stuff. So for me, again, because of its errant behaviour, and that's been that one branch of cryptozoology, to me it really is, again, a cryptozoology film, as well as an adventure and a western. Now, Piranha. I tried to track this down so I could give some more comment on it. I do remember watching it as a kid, and again, so I can't remember much about it. All I remember is again, we took it cryptozoology in the term of out-of-place animals. I can't remember whether they've been released or they've escaped from somewhere and they've got into a river system in the US. And again, it's a public holiday or a resort somewhere, and they get in and they start eating a load of people. So again, it's that whole thing about out-of-place animals. Probably, tied in there with slasher pics and things like that. Probably a lot of blood. I mean, it's many, many years since I've seen it. It's one of those ones you go into school and somebody's mum and dad had managed to get it on video somewhere, and they'd be telling you all about it, and then you'd be trying to hunt down a copy and you never could. So, moving into the 80s, I put down 80s schlock and unexpected delights when off sick from school. I'll explain a bit more about that. So there we have morally reprehensible character, loads of money, nothing from the 80s. Set against things like, anybody remembers the Battle of the Beanfield, that whole thing about that social, the whole social stuff in terms of sort of like Thatcherism and the response to that in the 1980s. Onto the music scene, found a clip there, or a little picture there of two young goths. So all of these would have affected my time in the 1980s, and of course the Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World. Still think it stands up as a really, really great series. So all of this sort of stuff again affected what was going on for me in the 1980s and how has it affected my interest in cryptozoology. So I mentioned about sort of like surprises when off from school. Now there are two films that I stumbled across. Either I'd had a day off school for whatever reason, or I stumbled across these quite by accident. Now I'm thinking about it, this must have been, I must have seen these in the early or mid-1980s, because I'm trying to rationalise how would I have seen them. Well, I remember I saw them both in the afternoon one day. First film, there we go. It was made about 1970 and starring a young Burt Reynolds and What's Not to Love. So, great film called Skullduggery. Now, Skullduggery is set in New Guinea, and Burt Reynolds plays a guy called Douglas. He's sort of like a harmless, good-natured, low-level opportunist stroke entrepreneur, and he's all working in this remote post with this guy called Cribsy, and they're doing sort of odd jobs and getting by. While they're there, in flies another plane with a missionary and an anthropologist called Dr. Graham, and they're heading to this region called the Takura region to look for a range of, she's looking for evidence of early humans in the area. So they Burt Reynolds and his mate get onto this trip somehow as a hired help. They get on there, and again it follows that very, very, very Tarzan script. It's sort of like they're going up country, it's like, they're going on canoe safaris, they've got native bearers, they come up against hostile tribes. There aren't any rhinos or elephants or lions because they don't exist in New Guinea, so there's no animal stuff in there, although you do see some crocodiles at one point. So they go further up, and they go to this region, and the reason why the Burt Reynolds character and his mate want to go on now is because they've heard that there are phosphorus deposits in the region, and they've heard that there's a lot of money can be made through mining phosphorus for the colour TV industry, which was probably booming about that point. So they get to this region, and while they're there, they find a skull, and Dr. Graham, the anthropologist, poo-poos it. She goes, "Oh, you're making fun out of me. You've just picked this one up." She says, this is barely like 10, 15 years old. And then Cribsy spies this rock face, and he goes, "I think there might even be some younger ones." And then on this rock face, you see several hairy humanoid forms jumping around this rock face, going into these caves. Then he goes on to looking at these. They try to actually sort of make some sort of contact with these creatures, and it doesn't really happen for a while. I think they wait a week, and then Cribsy, who's Burt Reynolds' mate, manages to entice a young female who he nicknames Topazia, with a tin of all things spam. Okay, so they really love spam, and that is the key to it. So they then start, getting enticing all these creatures with spam, and it's actually sort of like really, it all feels quite nice. And these are the creatures there. So one thing I really liked about it, like unlike most cryptozoology things, when they're talking about these creatures who they call the tropi, for no apparent reason, they're just called the tropi or the tropy. One of the reasons that I like it is because it's actually a population of individuals. It's not just one thing. So they do this, and it all goes quite well. And it seems quite nice. On the way, sort of like Burt Reynolds has developed a relationship with the anthropologist, Dr. Graham, and it all looks quite nice. But somehow the news gets out to the wider world that there's these creatures have been discovered in inland New Guinea. Then it all gets very, very, very dark, very, very dark, very, very quickly. You jump some months ahead, and Burt Reynolds is working sort of like as a good-natured overseer, but they've got the trophy mining the phosphorus out of the mines. And each time they get a certain load, they mine a certain load, they get a tin of spam. So it's very much, it follows like that. And it does, and then they get some more of a debate about, well, there's the bit where the missionary, is very, very concerned because he's actually saying that these creatures show reason and therefore they must be human. And then at one point he's about to baptise them and someone says to him, you do realise if you baptise them that you'll probably be excommunicated because you've committed heresy, because you don't have no proof that these creatures are human. So it gets very, very dark, and again, some of the other things that happen, Cribsy, so Burt Reynolds' mate, has, I used to tell it in its broadest possible way, a relationship with Tapazia. She becomes pregnant, so she's one of the creatures, gives birth to a stillborn baby, and for some reason, and again, I'm still quite unclear why, but Burt Reynolds takes the blame for it to save Cribsy. Not in terms that he made Tapazia pregnant, but he says that he killed the baby. And it all goes to court, and then it all becomes very, very racialised, where you get like a version of the Black Panthers appear. You get people saying about that, what do you mean by human? Essentially, white Westerns. Is that what you mean by humans, or do you mean? And it all gets very, very mixed up and dark, and so it ends in this court case with this discussion about what actually is human. It's quite a clever film in some ways, and it ends there. Poor old Tapazia is brought into the courtroom as an exhibit. She panics, terrified, escapes, and unwittingly kills herself. So again, that's what I mean, it goes from very, very light-hearted to very, very dark, very, very quickly. But again, I don't think you ever see it. I mean, it took me ages to try and track down a copy of this, but it really is quite a quizzical and thought-provoking thing, and it reminds me of the story of, which some of you may be aware of Zana, a wild woman who was known from the Caucasus region in the late 19th century, who had gave birth to human children, and was saying that, was she human? How closely was she related to human soil? So there's a precedent for this as well. So it was really quite interesting. And then the other film from this era I remember is a Japanese-American production called Half Human. It's only an hour long, and it's set in the context of these three American scientists talking about what had happened in Japan, something that happened in Japan. Essentially, an expedition had gone out, and it split up. Three young people went one direction, 2 young people went in another direction, and the 2 who went in the one direction were mysteriously killed. The only thing where they looked for evidence of it, they found their broken, crushed bodies, and then a telltale pair of naked, giant humanoid footprints leading away. This triggered another expedition headed by Professor Tanaka to look for the human. He's an anthropologist, to look for the ape man. Essentially, it goes in, and while they're looking, they discover this very, very isolated village of people who are obviously inbred. They've been living in this isolated mountain region for a long time, and they worship the ape man. And there's all sorts of questions about, because actually sometimes the ape man acts very, very kindly and very, very gently, and sometimes he's very, very aggressive. So there's all these questions again about the nature of humanity and what constitutes an animal and what constitutes a human. And again, he's the ape man is the last survivor, along with his supposed son. Once again, it all ends very, very tragically. But again, ends up on this what I found quite interesting. The American scientists at the end are talking about, somebody says, isn't it a shame about the extinction of a species before we got to study it? And yet one of the head scientists says, but how do we know there's not more of these types of creatures living in other places in the world that we might find somehow? A very, very progressive view of science, and when we compare it to what many mainstream scientists are like now in this subject, who poo-poo the idea of much to do with cryptozoology, just out and out. So, further into the 80s, because of out-of-place animals, another film I remember, but I was trying to track down a copy and couldn't get hold of one, was called Alligator from 1980. So, what I do remember of it, the film starts with a little baby alligator that somebody buys as a pet, gets flushed down the toilets, lives in the sewers, lives again, it's very allegorical, it survives off of human waste. I'm not talking poo, but all the stuff that goes into the sewers and stuff that's flushed into the drains and that. Grows to huge size. I think it's also something chemical, that might have affected its growth size and that. And essentially, it breaks out somehow. There's clips of it walking on roads. As cryptids are often likely to do, they like crashing what would ordinarily be a happy event. So Snow Beast crashed the prom queen fair. Alligator crashes a wedding. I think he eats the mother of the bride alongside a few other people. So it's one of those sort of things, but very, very out of the place animals, and that side of cryptozoology. But also, again, another interesting metaphor. If we think about, it happens all over the UK, but the whole thing with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, when everybody was buying the little turtles and then got rid of them when they were too big. Our local parks that had ponds had loads and loads of the turtles in for a long while, and you just think that they shouldn't have been there. They should have been in the swamps of Florida or wherever they should have been, not in a cold London park. And now, not here. Good-looking young men and women must die. So with a lot of these films, they follow a lot of Hollywood cliches, and one of the ones is sexualised teenagers, particularly if they're unmarried, or if they don't wear very much clothes, must die. It's a great Hollywood tradition. It still carries on to this day, I think, particularly in American cinema. And Q the Winged Serpent from 1982 is essentially the story of Quetzalcoatl, the Aztec god, the winged serpent, who essentially in a couple of forms has come back to life. And like so many monster flicks, this one is set in New York. And what it is, it starts off with a series of unexplained disappearances and body parts falling from the sky. That, obviously completely inexplicable. And at the same time, the local police department are uncovering all these very, very grisly murders that look to be ritual sacrifice. And what essentially happens over the course of the film is that essentially there's someone or a group of people are giving themselves over to some ancient Aztec cult that does in terms of the ritual sacrifice, but that's also done in terms of bringing back to life Quetzalcoatl, the winged serpent. The story goes on, and essentially what happens is so more and more of these inexplicable deaths are occurring. The Quetzalcoatl, that looks a bit like King Ghidorah from the Godzilla films, taking people from the tops of flats, so it's like workmen, people. There's one great scene where there's three young people wearing next to nothing in a swimming pool. They've all got to die, obviously. So they're grabbed, people are dropped down and there's stuff keeps falling and everything. So people are reporting, but people are still seeing the creature around. So there's reports coming in, the police start investigating it. Quite by accident, one guy discovers that the Quetzalcoatl has a nest at the top of the Chrysler building in New York. He's committed a crime, and in exchange for being absolved of this crime, he agrees to tell the police department where this nest is. So they all go up there, they destroy the egg, and Quetzalcoatl attacks them, kills a few before Quetzalcoatl dies itself again, falling from a great big building, very, very reminiscent of King Kong. And again, like so many films from this era, it sort of ends like that, like with nothing else really. But it does go, you see this picture of this old, rundown, empty, dilapidated mansion, and inside it flicks to this picture of this ramshackle nest with another huge egg on it. Which again, which is like a lot of these films, they always hinted that there was going to be a sequel. There never ever was, but they always hinted that there might be. And then, 1984, Razorback, one of my favourites. Another outside animals, or I call one big rasher. Great film. It's quite atmospheric. At the beginning of it, it's very, very Mad Max-esque, a lot of it, in terms of it's seen the Australian outback as not as this particularly beautiful place, but as this actually really quite grimy, quite dilapidated, quite abused environment. Alongside that, it's also that particularly one of the opening scenes is very reminiscent to me of John Ford's The Searchers, with this isolated homestead and this sense of impending doom coming towards it. And one of the starts off early in the film where an old guy is he's babysitting his infant grandson. He's aware that something's going on. He goes outside his house. He's knocked over by this giant razorback, which is a wild, essentially a feral pig. This is a giant one the size of a rhinoceros. Knocks him over, literally barges through into his house, takes his grandson and presumably eats the grandson. Then the old man goes on trial because there's no proof that he's accused of the baby's murder, but he's let off because no one can prove that he did murder. But he becomes a bit like the character Quint from Jaws in terms of like he wants to go on this this vengeance raid. He wants to kill as many razorbacks as he can. At the same time, there's this once again from New York, a journalist coming in who's investigating animal rights abuses, comes in because she's investigating the shooting of kangaroos and wallabies in Australia. So she comes in, she starts investigating this abattoir. The two guys at the abattoir give chase to her. One of them's they catch up with her, one of them's about to rape her, but then she gets saved by the razorback, who comes in and scares the guy off. In order to receive his thanks for saving the woman from raping her, the razorback then kills her and eats her. So, it's from one fate to another one. That then triggers at some point her fiancé comes over to look for her to find out what's gone on. And again, it's very much like looking around and trying to find down and hunt down this giant razorback. It's quite goes again. It's a bit in the middle. It goes quite trippy, where the fiancé finds himself alone in the outback, and he's sort of like being surrounded by the pigs, but not the giant one. And he managed to get out of that situation. And essentially, it's sort of like it all comes together. And again, once again, there's a big showdown at the abattoir with the guys from the abattoir, the fiancé, and the giant razorback, who is eventually turned into sausage meat. And again, that's where it ends us there as well. But again, it's that whole thing, in terms of allegorical sort of like learning a lesson, that whole thing about how when we introduce wildlife from one environment to another environment, things can get wholly out of hand. So razorbacks in Australia are a huge issue, the same way that rabbits are, mice have been as well, where they just bloomed, and they pose more of a threat to native wildlife than they do people. But again, great film, again very, very slasher-esque, lots of blood and stuff like that. But again, I think it stands up very, very, very well. It's very, very atmospheric. So, into the 21st century. And you might think, well, what about the 90s? to me, I think that, I don't know whether, there's two things, the only films I can think of from the 90s classify as cryptozoology is obviously Harry and the Hendersons, and the other one that I do really like as a really good film is Congo. I think there's loads of thought in it, but I really like it. It's a good sort of adventure film. But I can't remember much in the other way of films during that period. There were a few good documentaries, one of them I think called The X-Creatures, then there was one To the Ends of the Earth that I really liked, but not much in the way of films. That may well do the fact that during the 90s, I was in the height of my nightclubbing years and I wasn't really taking much notice of films and stuff, but I do think there was a real dearth of films at that time. But I do think it started good for documentaries and then into the 21st century, but it became, I think, was there a bit of an overload of things like Monster Quest, Finding Bigfoot, and one thing is because I just found them so highly intense. There's just so much shouting and screaming going on, and blokes running around and shouting at each other and shouting "God damn" and shooting at the night, and that's it. And then they've discovered something, or they haven't discovered something. To me, I just find it, you know, my head just can't deal with that sort of documentary sort of stuff. And I put there, yeah, from haunted generation to an overly stimulated generation, as it catering for a modern market, that stuff. Also, the other thing now, anytime you do see, there's loads of like cheap rate Bigfoot films out now, but Bigfoot's always got fangs and claws. You go look at like the promo documentaries or the trailers for them. It's always like they've got great big fangs. They look more like werewolves than they ever do like, you know, 8'8" people. But yeah, there is some hope, even if highly sexed teenagers are still meeting their doom and face the cryptids. That Hollywood cliche is still not changing, it is still there. So, this is one great one, I think, called Letters from the Big Man. We have a main character, and she's an artist and a government hydrologist, and she's assessing an area after a fire to look at like what the impact of this fire has been and how an area is recuperating. It's a very, very gentle film, but as she's going into this wilderness on her own, she's an experienced outdoors woman, she goes out there and she realises that over time she's beginning to interact with a lone male Sasquatch. Now there's no sexual anything in this, it's just that he's curious about her, she's curious about him. And when I say they develop a friendship, it's not Harry and the Hendersons. She's not sitting there, you know, giving him sort of like, you know, her bowl of porridge or whatever like that. But there is this whole thing about like gifting. So he might leave her certain things where she can find them. She leaves things for him. So it's a very, very quite sweet film. And again, it ends with something about, you know, this thing about, you know, are we taking down the forest? What are we doing to the natural environment that might necessarily, that might be harming these environments? Now this is, again, a really, really good one called The Hunter, starring William Dafoe, and he's a mercenary, bounty hunter, scientist. You don't quite know what he is. Essentially whatever he is, he's incredibly specialist. And he has been employed by an unspecified client to track down what he is told is the last Tasmanian tiger or thylacine in existence. He goes to Tasmania, and he's there under the guise of being a scientist researching Tasmanian devils, as opposed to Tasmanian tigers. So he goes in there, and he's staying with this family, bedridden woman and her 2 children. But he keeps himself to himself. While he's there, he quickly realises that he's in the middle of a war zone, but the local community, who are virtually all loggers, who rely on the wilderness to log, and environmentalists, who are generally outsiders, but who want to come in and to save this quite pristine environment. And it goes backwards and forwards, him going back to the family, he builds up a relationship with the family, and he goes into the wilderness. And one of his wilderness trips, he gives chase to what he thinks is the thylacine or Tasmanian tiger, takes a tumble, ends up in a cave that he believes is a Tasmanian tiger lair. So he's in there, so he thinks now he's tracked down where this creature is. And he's, throughout the course of this, through other people coming involved, he realised that the client who has employed him, he's sort of like aware that they want to get the last Tasmanian tiger because the Tasmanian tigers produce a type of toxin that might be very, very lucrative to a company that get hold of it. So again, it's very, very much tied into corporate interests manipulating nature for their own benefit. They want the rights to this. That's what they want to do. So he, for whatever reason, he gets very, very disturbed by that. Refuses to play games. There's all sorts of human drama gets involved in it. This one I'm definitely not going to give you the endings if you haven't seen it. It's so worth seeing. It's such a beautiful film. And it does end. He does get to see the Tasmanian tiger, and I will leave it there for that film for the moment. Not exactly a huge cryptozoology film, but there's one tiny bit of cryptozoology in it. It's a great film for anybody who hasn't seen it. Sam Neill plays an older man who his wife fosters a young Maori boy, about 10, 11 years old, and his wife dies, and he's still, although he's quite an irascible old sod, he sort of forms a bit of a bond with the boy, and the boy is a bit of like a young irascible sod, and the two of them sort of like form a bit of a relationship, as in a friendship. And that's it. It's a very, very sweet film. But part of the film is that they find the huia, which is the South Island huia, which is an extinct species of, or supposedly extinct species of bird living on the South Island of New Zealand. And again, it's very much like, it's not a cryptozoology film, but I liked the element of cryptozoology that crept into it. And then Border, great film, absolutely brilliant. For me, this is probably one of the very, very best. In terms of me, where does this fit in cryptozoology? Very much in terms of the field of hominology, so essentially the study of hairy bipeds, so anything Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, orang pendek, anything like that. So Border starts with the character on the left, is a woman called Tina with, as you might see, distinctly Neanderthaloid features. And it comes about that so she works for border control, and the way she works for them is that she has these, one we might describe as heightened senses. So she can sniff out things like guilt in people. She can also got these heightened senses that somebody's done something wrong, things like that. So she's very, very, very good border guard. But she's quite alone. She's been brought up, and her parents, or the people she thinks are her parents, have told her that, that much as they love her, she has a genetic deformity. She doesn't really go much into genetic deformity at first, but that's what she's been told. But she's told she's been very, very loved and things like that. And she has a scar at the base of her spine that she alludes to. And then one day she meets this other character, where she's working. She meets the character on the right. This is the only time she's ever met someone who looks like her. Is a guy called Vor. And he's talking to her, he's obviously flirting with her. And over time they develop a bit of a friendship. She also, although both of them have a real sort of like association with animals, but in terms of they're very, very, they get on very, very well with most animals, but they both share an absolute terror of thunderstorms. So there's these things about she finds this similarity in someone, and eventually he discloses to her that they're both trolls. And what he actually says was that the trolls were a distinct, or have been a distinct species in the hills of, or in the rural areas of Scandinavia, but probably because of their gifts that they have and their senses. For years they were sort of like, essentially by the sound of it, like herded out of the woods or captured, and the adults were experimented on, and the younger children were essentially, they had tails, the tails were operated on, they all had their tails removed, and they were then farmed out to families. Tina confronts her human father about this, who confirms this. He was working at one of these like psychiatric experimental places, and says to her that yes, that was the case, and actually her real name, her troll name was Reva, or Reva, and it goes from there really, and it ends again with, you find out the whole thing is that Vor's involved in this, the man is involved in this human baby trafficking thing, where babies are trafficked for, to take part in, essentially they're kidnapped and used for child pornography, and he's doing it out of vengeance. He wants to get his own back on the human race, essentially. Reva, or Tina, can't deal with this because she still thinks that's the wrong thing, and she feels like she was treated well by the humans that she knew, so she didn't want to do that. But essentially, I won't end up with any spoilers, but it ends at the end of it with Tina, or Reva, asserting her trollness, and she starts making her way back to a place in Finland where she's heard that a group of trolls have survived, and she makes her way, the film ends with her beginning to make her way there. This is one of those films I would love to see, a follow-up or a sequel. I would love to see her finding a troll community. And it's very much like, if we look at this in terms of cryptozoology, so in terms of, there's a whole theory that the trolls, as they are seen in Scandinavia now, are a legacy of almost like a cultural memory of Neanderthals in Scandinavia, and that was maybe where that actually came from. And you still hear reports of hairy hominids in Finland, where they're often called the tree eaters. So again, I think it's a really, really good film. For me, very, very clear cryptozoology, but it's obviously very, very fantasy, it's very, very human. It's a really, really good film. So, coming to the end of it, my personal wish list for the future, what would I like to see if anything's coming up? I would like to see an adaptation of a possible Sasquatch story from the missing 411 case. The 411 series of books written by a retired police officer called David Polides, who documented, or has ongoing documented, all these cases of people missing in national parks in the US. And some of them clearly seem to allude to possible kidnappings by Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Another great story, some years ago, it's about 16 years ago, I spent time on a Native American reservation in South Dakota, and out there, on the next reservation up, there was a small community called Little Eagle, and in 1976, over a period of about 5-6 months, it was for whatever reason this target of all these different Bigfoot sightings and experiences going on. A really, really good sort of like film around that. I'd find that fascinating. A Sasquatch habituation story. Here, quite a lot of stories where perhaps people in remote parts of the US have ongoing interactions, sometimes over multi-generations of their families, in remote farms and things like that, generally with other, essentially families or small groups, tribes, clans, whatever you want to call them, of Sasquatch creatures. yeah, I put a sensible monster story, not them things like Anaconda or Megalodon or Meg. I just want something like quite serious, actually. I like a joke, but I also but I'm a very serious person about things like that. So I want something like if there's something about a giant anaconda, I want something like about a report of a 40-foot anaconda, not a 400-metre long anaconda. A 40-foot anaconda where, perhaps there's a lot of documentary evidence around it, that you can build actually a really, really coherent film around it. And also, I mean, people things like this, but perhaps really, really basic and things like that. For me, one of the really, really lovely parts of cryptozoology I love is about things like the thylacine, is like, creatures that were known to exist very, very recently that are supposedly extinct. One of my favourites is the pink-headed duck. Literally, it's a duck, but with a pink head. But I would love some sort of 2-hour film about, an expedition or whatever to find this, and just looking at things like that. I like sensible stuff like this. I don't need a load of CGI to be interested. I like my brain being stimulated, not a load of. I don't need a load of, as I said, people running around with shouting and hollering all the time. I like sort of intelligent stuff. But that will be my wish list for the future. I could probably put about 3 dozen more on there, but obviously I won't. I'll keep it at 5. And that's it. That's my introduction to cryptozoology film.